Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Seasons Ebb and Flow for the season of divorce and beyond. I am Lee Wright, a divorce coach, and I am looking forward to today's interview. I will be interviewing Moshe Ben Lev, and he is also a divorce coach, and he has a program that he works with his wife, who's a therapist. And they work with couples sometimes together, and then sometimes together, and then separately. And he's going to tell us a little bit about how their program works and um, the dynamics that they have found that have been beneficial working with their clients. And so I'm going to open it up to you, Moshe, and let us tell you just a little bit, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into what you're doing. And then we will dive right in.
Good morning. Hi, everybody. Um, I have been an educator for the last 30 years, working primarily as an education director in faith-based institutions. And over those years, had thousands of students and families who I've had the opportunity to interact with and meet with and listen to. And I dealt with a lot of families of divorce, those going through divorce, those who were already divorced when I came on the scene, and those who were going through separation. And I often had many conversations with those parents individually. And over the years, I really began to listen more and more to the students in my schools. I'd walk the hallways and hear students talking to one another. Or I'd have a child who was distressed and have a conversation with them, and they would bring up the issue of their parents and what was going on and the struggles they were having. And I decided about 4 years ago to become a divorce coach so that I could help with those families and with those students in particular, and have really been focused a great deal on the parenting, co-parenting aspects of divorce, and how parents can be most effective in raising a child, with a stable child, in an environment where there are two households, where perhaps one parent or both parents have remarried and moved on, and making sure that that child gets what they need, and is in a stable environment in both homes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I think when I work with my clients, like I am constantly reminding them that children's health and well-being absolutely needs to be front and center. And yes, the dynamic between you and your ex is something that is a challenge. But if you can put your kids in the front and center of your mind and remind each other that that is your goal, to work together to make their lives smooth, then it can help the divorce process itself stay on track in a healthy way. So I think that child-centered approach just helps everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also have to acknowledge, look, parenting is not easy regardless of whether we're divorced or not. It's not
True.
an easy thing. But I
Mhm.
think what we forget is that we are in our own childhoods, um, experience things. Um, some of them may have been very, you know, families where there was serious things like domestic violence or other terrible traumas, terrible events, maybe ongoing. In other homes, there was, it seemed like a happy home where both parents worked together to raise their child, yet all of us bring out with us our own sense of how we were parented, our
Yeah.
own wounds, traumas, whatever you want to call them, that
Yes.
we bring into our own parenting and the way that we
Yes.
parent.
Yes.
Some of it's conscious and some of it's not.
Right.
Um, and sometimes we don't realize, but our children trigger us. How many times have we, I mean, me as a parent, for example, how many times have I yelled when there wasn't necessarily a reason to have yelled? Or
Yeah.
I got angry over something which perhaps I just misconstrued because my child triggered something from my childhood, something in my unconscious that was brought to the surface. I may not be aware of what it was, but my reaction to it was anger. And that anger, or whatever it may be, affects how my child is parented. So
Hmm.
it is to, at a certain extent, it goes from generation to generation. And
Yes.
being aware of that is kind of what I've focused on greatly.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when I look at my personal experience, I feel like our upbringings and the environment that we grew up in has such an impact on the way we run our household, parent. And that was one of the biggest challenges between me and my ex-husband when we were young in our 20s, getting together and having fun together. Our childhood backgrounds didn't really come into play that much. It was like, oh, his childhood background is so different, and his was much more of that household that you don't talk about things, sweep things under the rug, very calm and peaceful. And I was drawn to that a little bit because mine was chaotic, less structured, a lot of bickering. We could fight and then it would just go away after 10 minutes. There was a lot of like probably unconscious nervous system dysregulation that we weren't aware of. And that's not the healthiest, but then also sweeping things under the rug is not the healthiest. So we were both probably, if you think of a bell curve, we each grew up kind of more in like the extremes of each. And his was a little colder, mine was very warm, but neither was perfect. We both appreciated what the other brought to the table. But then when we had kids and we're trying to create a household, and I'm bringing my style that I know, and he's bringing his style that he knows, and they're polar opposites, and trying to make that work, and we weren't mature enough, um, or self-aware enough to recognize that that was causing so much conflict. And then you have kids and your parenting styles kind of revert back to what you know. It started to cause a lot of tension. And maybe if we had had therapy early on to learn some of these things, but we didn't, and it just the friction and frustrations built. And so I do think that your upbringing impacts so much of the way that you're going to run your household and parent. And so I always tell my kids now, like, look at whoever you're dating and considering partnering with. What does their household look like? Because chances are that's kind of what your partner is going to want their household to run like. And are you comfortable with that? And will that work for you? So yeah, it's we assume a lot of us. I know my ex said, oh, I don't want to be like my parents in so many areas,
Mm.
but unconsciously we revert back to that because that's what we know and it feels comfortable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we adapt. There are things that we're conscious of. So if you were, for example, your parent when you were a child, their way of disciplining you was perhaps hitting you, spanking you, or something that was you were very aware of. You make a decision as a parent. Yeah, this worked for me, and I'm going to do the same thing, or this really was painful, and I really feel traumatized by that kind of experience. I'm not going to do the same. That's not how I'm going to parent. But there's so much more to it than that. There's so much under the surface. There's so many things that we don't realize that our brains are very interesting. So the way that we categorize things, the way we put some of those memories, especially if they're really, traumatic to us. And when I use the word trauma, I don't mean like a very extreme event that occurred. It may be small things, which is why in Imago therapy, which we can talk about in a minute, we talk about woundings. People, what happens to us are wounds. But there's so many things. I'll give you a perfect example. Um, about 5 or 6 years ago, my sister and I were having a conversation. We're just talking about family and the way we parent and stuff like that. And she said to me, "Hey, do you remember that time when you almost hit mom?" I'm like, "What?" She goes, "Yeah, yeah, you almost hit mom." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" She goes, "Yeah, mom, you were about 16 years old, and my sister's 8 years younger than I am." And she said, "Yeah, you were in the kitchen." And she used to have this habit because at that time she was really kind of going through menopause and was the hormones were all over the place. She got sometimes really physically, a little bit physically violent, I guess is one way of putting it. He used to slap me across the face, which
Mm,
was terrible. Um, and she said, "Do you remember that time she went to slap you? You grabbed her wrist and you said to her, 'If you ever hit me again, I'm going to kill you.'"
mm, wow.
And I said, "No, I don't remember that." And it slowly began to remember it.
Yeah.
So there are and then you have to think, okay, I don't remember that. That was in my subconscious. My sister brought that out in me.
I.
Certainly a therapist would bring it out in me probably too. But but the effects, the feelings, the way I felt, those are still there. And those can be
Mhm.
triggered by something. We don't know what's going to trigger us, but something our child might do or a partner might do that would trigger those feelings of anger, those feelings of extreme emotions, those feelings of feeling ashamed about the way that we are, the way, and those come across to our children. Those are played out with our families in particular. So those are what I mean. There's some things we're conscious about, we adapt to them, but there's things that we just don't and we can't. We have to figure out how are we going to make sure that those subconscious things that dysregulate us, that we have to figure out a way of regulating ourselves, that
Yeah.
we don't damage our own relationships with other people, both
Mm,
in adulthood, because we bring our childhood stuff with us into our adult relationships. So that's
mhm.
the couples piece. But then there's the parenting piece. How we parent our children also goes back to those subconscious memories of how we were parented. And it can do real damage if we're not aware of them and when we're triggered, how we can effectively deal with it that doesn't pass that damage on to our children. That's kind of what I'm
100%.
interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. And I it is nice when you have a sibling. My brother and I are very close and we share with each other and help remind each other and help each other heal and change the way we parent currently by reflecting on things that and jogging each other's memory from things. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
if you're lucky enough to have a sibling who you're close with and who can help you process some of that, all of that's helpful.
Yeah. I,
And
I agree with you. And I think finding the right program to help you. So my wife and I discovered some years ago this thing called Imago dialogue, Imago couples counseling, um, and it was started by a married couple who themselves were going through some marital problems. Harville Hendricks and Helen the Kelly Hunts, and they were experimenting. He's a psychotherapist, so they both are. So they were experiment. How can we improve our marriage? How can we make sure? Because they were ready to like end their marriage,
mhm,
and they came up with this idea of a dialogue that looked at the childhood relationships, those subconscious things, and how they resurface in adulthood. And they created something called the Imago dialogue, which is now today what like 2,500 Imago therapists throughout the world use. And these are therapists, but they're also facilitators, and there are people like me who do parenting using Imago, and trained in that. And what's beautiful about the Imago dialogue is it gives you an opportunity to connect in perhaps ways that you are not connecting anymore as a couple. Um, and I actually spent a weekend, my wife and I, as part of her certification training, we had to do this long weekend during COVID where we did Imago, and it was transforming. It was just incredible.
Mm,
And how it works is that you know, you and I say we're a married couple, and we're not listening to each other. We're
yeah.
constantly wounding each other, or we're just getting mad at each other. We can't sit and have a real conversation. If we're facing, with how it works, you sit, you face one another eye to eye, and the therapist or facilitator prompts the person, okay, tell us what it is that bothers you today, about your what your spouse does at home, that is an issue. You will say what you're going to say. Your spouse, your partner, who's sitting right opposite you, looking straight at you, has no way of escaping, listening to you, listens intently to what you're saying, and then has to mirror back to you what you have said, which
Hmm.
sounds simple, but it's actually very hard because you have to listen very intently. You have to
Yeah.
understand, you've got to process what's being heard. By the way, for the person who's saying it, it's also powerful because they're getting to hear back their own words. So there's
Yeah.
a lot of process for someone, for me, for example, who processes things differently, perhaps than others. Um, it's really powerful. And
Yeah.
then after the person's mirrored and they've repeated back, this is what you said. Did I hear you clearly? The person says, yes, you did. And then you ask, is there more you want to share? You go through this process until eventually the person has expressed and been mirrored. And then you validate it. How do you validate it? So the person will say, I understand this is what you're saying. You've said that I leave a mess in the house that I don't clear up. That I don't listen to you when you ask me for help. And these are the things you're saying to me. Then comes the empathy part. This is called the move dialogue, MOVE. So the empathy dialogue part is, so I understand this really bothers you. And I get that you find it really hard when you come home and you find a mess everywhere. It might not matter to me, but it's important to you. It makes sense to you. And, I'm really sorry that I've caused you that kind of bad feeling because it reminds you maybe of your childhood or the way that, these conversations make a lot of sense to both people. They get to slow down, have a conversation, listen intently, and then work on a way of being able to improve the relationship by being strongly connected. So that's the
Yeah.
basics of the move dialogue. Enables couples to connect in ways perhaps they hadn't before, to share, to validate, to show empathy, to be understanding. It strengthens the marital relationship for sure.
Yeah.
Um, and if it's done on a kind of a daily basis, it really is quite interesting. It also brings
Yeah.
up things from your childhood because,
Yeah.
you know, you end up exploring areas of your life and who you are that is really resurfaces or surfaces in a different way. It helps you to also regulate better. So
Yeah.
they wrote this book years ago called Getting the Love You Want. Um, it was a wonderful book. It was, as I said, transformative. And Oprah Winfrey happened to pick up on this book, and made them very famous by having them on the show like
Mm,
25, 30 times. Um,
right.
Harville in particular. Um, and I, after doing this weekend with my wife, was so excited about this concept. And it turns out that I didn't know at the time that they have a parent component to it. Because
Mm,
Harville and Helen realized early on, hey, if you're a couple and you're trying to have a good relationship and you're trying to work together to create this bond, this connection, if you don't do it with your children, then that's going to be a problem. It seeps into every part and aspect of your life. So they started working on parenting. So that's where I got my training, doing parenting. They have a book called Giving the Love That Heals.
yeah.
Um, so that's what Imago, roughly what Imago does.
Okay. And so, yeah, it's interesting when we start talking, ironically, my mom is a therapist and she's Imago trained. So when we found that you had that as well, it
Mm,
was like, oh, there's because she introduced me to that when my ex and I were struggling, and we did a few sessions with an Imago therapist, and it is a wonderful, transformative program with learning how to communicate and validate and dig up the resentments and mirror back uh, what it is rather than thinking about how you're going to respond. You actually have to mirror back to the person what they are saying so that you stay with that person rather than defend, and it becomes a ping pong of I'm right, you're wrong. And I think unfortunately my ex and I were like a little too far along the path, and
Mm,
maybe just not a good fit at that point in our lives. We had just grown into different people. I always say we had a good run and we grew up and we're ready for different things. But um, I do think Margot is an amazing uh, way to give your marriage one last chance if you are kind of on the brink. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you and your wife work together, where she kind of works with the couples and you work with the focus on the parenting?
sure. So I just want to emphasize that Imago therapists are actual trained therapists. I'm not a trained therapist. I want to make that clear. Um, but there's room for people like me who do coaching, facilitating, have a background in a different kind of background that brings something into the room. I think that's helpful. So how we do it together? Well, she explained first of all my wife how she does it by herself. When she does it by herself, she has this couple sitting face to face, and she is on one side of them, on the outside, and she facilitates the discussion and the dialogue, and she asks questions, and she really kind of does a lot of prompting. She doesn't she shows them mirroring and how it works at the beginning, and then she has them mirror each other. So she models it that way. But what we found early on is that when you bring another person into the room, especially if it's a partner of in my case, of my wife, the therapist, it's an extra. I think it's really an extra wonderful resource. It brings another layer into the room because you've got in our cases of the way we do therapy, at least you have a man and a woman in the room. It's good to have another man in the room who can be a support. I think partly for the man, uh, but it also shows you modeling of how a couple can have a conversation, how they can be um, a couple that's good to model how a couple, a healthy relationship should be. So she does that. I come into the room, I bring in the parenting piece. What do I mean by the parenting piece? So we have couples that have children. Sometimes they want to focus mostly on themselves. In our case, we have a lot of couples that are divorced and it's their second marriage, maybe for one, maybe for both. There may be a fight or something going on with the ex, which is affecting their children. Sometimes there are children from both, the previous marriage and the new marriage that are being brought into the room. So I'm helping with the parenting piece. How do we discipline the children properly in a way that is loving, that shows that we care, that we are a couple together, even if we don't always agree on everything? There's a whole process of doing that. Um, and so when we start talking about the children, I'm reminding them of if a child has neurodiversity issues,
Mm,
if a child has a certain personality, if a child, we talk about age development. A lot of parents don't understand age development, especially if you have a child that has neurodiversity
yeah.
issues. For example, I was working with a couple where a child has, pretty serious ADHD. The child is 15 years of age. Um, the child's not medicated, refuses to take the medication, is running around going crazy all the time. Um, and the parents are like focusing so much on the child's ADHD and the schoolwork and getting done what needs to get done that they haven't quite understood that there's the teen element too. There's the development of that child at that age and what one can expect. That part doesn't necessarily marry with the other when in your mind you're focused only on one issue. And the issue is homework being done, calmness in the house, being able to, have the family live in a calm state. Um, so those are things I work on with those parents, and my wife and I do it between us. So we go back and forth with the Imago, with the move, with the dialogue, with the parenting. It works really well.
And if parents have different parenting styles, like my ex and I, for example,
Yeah.
um, what are some ways that you help them in that scenario to um, work through those differences?
So there are a number of things. First of all, it's important for the co-parents to have an open communication, as hard as it may be. Both parents have to be honest and respectful of the conversations that they have about their values and beliefs. I mean, we know they have, obviously they know their values and beliefs when they're married. It didn't work out. But as far as parenting goes, it's really important to be roughly on the same page, or at least to be able to understand each other and acknowledge this is important to you, even if it's not important to me. And I will respect that. I will abide by that. I don't want to do damage. Um, all of this, the caveat to all of this is child comes first. As parents, we have to put away our own egos. We've got to put away our own stuff that came from the marriage that didn't work out. And we have to focus on the children. It's funny because one thing I remember we learned when we were doing our coaching course was how much, especially with mothers as opposed to fathers, how much they really wanted to do great parenting because they understood intellectually that the child is going through this terrible situation of parents dividing up house, splitting up. They understood it intellectually and they wanted to be there and they tried to put extra work in to making sure their child gets what they need. But actually, that's the time when we really are so vulnerable that we're not able to be the great parent we want to be.
Mhm.
So we have to understand and acknowledge that. And that's why it's important to work together being child focused. So you have to find common goals. Um, you know, parenting styles may be different, but there are things, we know we want the child to be respectful. We know we want the child to be a happy child. By identifying the shared goals and the values and coming to kind of a meeting point, I think that's really important. Um, Compromising, being flexible, those are essentials. We can't agree on everything. We will agree on some things. We have to be willing to compromise. It's not that different to when we were married. Um,
Yes.
but now it's even more important because there are two households and we're not reminding each other or seeing that
Yeah.
that value there face to face. There has to
Yeah.
be consistency. Um,
Mhm.
it's funny because again, when you're married, consistency can be a very, if we're not consistent as parents, our children get mixed messages. They get very confused, and they don't understand the expectations or the way we're disciplining or the routines that we're trying to create.
Right.
Um, we also, I think, we have to set boundaries by the
Yeah.
discussions. When we disagree, and we're going to disagree as co-parents, we it's okay to disagree. It's okay to have those conversations, but not in front of the child.
Hmm.
Not while we're on the phone, not while we're standing on the doorstep or wherever it is that we're swapping the kids over, we're
Yeah.
transitioning the kids. That's really important that the child is not a part of that.
Yes.
Um, Also, being respectful of each other's roles.
Hmm.
There are decisions made. If I'm responsible for my child's, we decided I'm responsible for the interaction with the school. I'm the one who, and actually, I'm a good example. My wife and I decided early on I'm an educator when it came to school stuff, especially if there were issues or even just conferences or whatever it was. I would be the parent that would go to the school. That was my strength.
Yeah.
And my wife was respectful of that, and didn't undermine, wanted to know,
Yeah.
but beyond that. A lot of parenting's trial and error, things change.
For
Um,
sure.
Also, children grow developmentally. There are different needs from the age of 7 to the age of 15.
Yes.
So it's important for those co-parenting skills to actually be really used effectively in that regard. Um,
Yeah.
and then there's, supporting each other, even when we disagree. Um, it's important to know that the decision that was made by, you know, me is being supported by my
Right.
co-parent. Even if I don't agree, I can say it to them. But
Hmm.
ultimately, that decision's been made because the child is in my household.
Hmm.
That's the decision.
And I
Uh,
think that's one of the biggest challenges if you are divorced and you have two different styles, is that even if you don't agree, it's better for the children if you provide a bit of a united front as much as possible. People tend to drop into their ego and want to tell the kids, even covertly, like, oh, my way's better, your other parent is digging in, or their opinion's wrong, or they're trying to push or control. And the thing is, if you want to address that together offline, great. But in front of the kids, even a united front helps the kids when there is two sides and the kids are kind of being given messages that the other side's wrong. It creates opportunity for the children to manipulate the situation. It creates confusion for the kids. Kids thrive on some structure. It doesn't have to be like black and white, but when they feel like the parents have such different opinions and approaches, the structure goes away completely. And for them, then they don't feel safe and secure that the parents have their back and an approach that will ensure their safety and security. So parents who are living in separate households trying to come up with some agreements of some consistency
mm,
of how they're going to parent in two separate homes that has some agreements of like, are we going to encourage that the kids do their homework and have some relative structure with bedtime, even as they get older, phone usage, and kind of stay on the same page is helpful for the kids rather than focusing on, I want to make the other parent look bad, so I'm going to say why my approach is better. And
yeah,
again, it just comes back to that child-centered focus.
absolutely. Lee, I can't tell you how many children I have seen where parents are fighting with each other through their children,
Yeah,
um, where they are just focused so much on the anger that brought them to that place where they got divorced. And
yeah,
they really haven't moved on. They may have moved on in the sense that they've had their own new relationships and they remarry or whatever. But the stuff they're saying in front of their child or to their child about their spouse, their ex-spouse, is they don't realize how damaging it is. And added to that, okay, the child has an opinion as well. And the child obviously, you know, sees things and is parented in a certain way by the other parent. When they bring it in the house and they say, Dad is such a jerk, he said this, it's really important for the other parent not to say, yeah, well, he was a real jerk when I was married, when we were married, and he did this. It's really important not to say anything. It's really important
so
to say,
hard, but
I,
it is
yeah, I
really
mean, you can empathize. Look, you can say, hey, I'm really sorry you feel that way, and it must be very painful for you. And why don't we talk a little bit more about that? Um, and and I think it's really important to say that. It may be even important to be able to say, well, that you feel that way. Did you tell your dad that you feel that
Mhm,
way?
exactly.
How
Yeah,
how can I
I
how can I
mean,
help you do that?
I can say from personal experience, sometimes I'm really good at the, "I'm sorry, I know it's really hard. Have you spoken to him? It's important for you to speak openly and have conversations with him and have a very honest relationship with him. And then there are the times where I'm like, yeah, I guess that's kind of why I'm not married to him anymore. So,
Sure.
as good as I try to be, it's really tough when you're in the moment but so the one thing I remind my clients is we're not perfect. We're going to have slips. We are going to say things periodically, but when you do, catch yourself and then come back to but we're all human and we do make mistakes, and it's worth it for you to circle back with him and maybe bring it up if it's bothering you, or you then address it with them in a healthy, non-attacking way,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so that you guys can try to ensure that the kids again feel like there is some semblance of a united front. And the
Exactly.
other thing that I wanted to ask you about is when kids are going back and forth to two different homes that have very different approaches and parenting styles, the settling back in when the kids arrive back after transition can be somewhat challenging.
Absolutely.
Can you give any thoughts on how to handle those transitions?
Yes. So it's funny. I was invited a while back to meet a mum's group who's a divorce mothers um, who had high conflict divorces and were really struggling. And one of the biggest struggles they had was their child coming back from the ex-husband in this case, and saying terrible things. The child will come back home and say, "You're lazy. You've never really worked properly. You're a terrible parent." I mean, this kind of stuff, and worse, basically verbatim saying what the father had said. And we talked a little bit about how to deal with that. And I think it's really important to remember that what our children are saying when they come back from, if it's an extreme, this is an extreme situation, but it does happen fairly frequently, sadly. It's not to remember, first of all, this isn't your child making this stuff up. It's not what they're feeling. They are basically giving a message, the message that they're hearing. The goal of that message is to make you feel badly as a parent. And so it's really important not to be reactionary, but to become more conscious, understand where it's coming from, do breathing exercises, whatever it is to help regulate yourself. And then to turn around, listen to what's being said, and to turn around and say, thank you for sharing what you just shared with me. It must be really hard for you to hear all of that. To hear your father talking about me like that must be very hard. How does it make you feel? How does it make you feel about me? How does it make you feel about me being your parent? That's really tough. Let's see if we can talk a little bit more about that. And you can unwrap it in a really loving way. But for the regular, that's an extreme. For the regular switching over of, you're coming home from the co-parent, there's going to be a very hard transition. It's never an easy transition. Some are easier than others, but some are not. So it's very important, first of all, to validate with your kids, to acknowledge that they feel the way they do. A child comes back. How many times have I heard a parent say to me, my child came home and for 2 days they were like a wild person. It was like they were staying with their father or with their mother. And it was crazy. And I didn't know what to do with them. It took me that long to get them to become. And they were using words that they would never use with me. And it's like, okay, that's the way it's going to be. We have to have a way of being able to handle that. Let's transition. Let's figure out a way to, first of all, understand where it's coming from, the feelings they have, processing those emotions that they're bringing back from the other parent, And it's okay, have a check-in conversation when they come in the house. Hey,
Mhm.
what have you been doing? What have you been up to? What's going on now? What's in your mind? Some people also have a ritual. Um, Sit and have with a younger child, sit and have a glass of cocoa and play a game or read a book or some kind of way of transitioning in. Not, for example, when they come home saying, okay, well, you've got to did you do your homework? This has to be done right now. And you don't forget, you've got to take the dog for a walk and you've got your chores and it's got to be the transition. Like for all of us, transition is hard from
Mhm.
anything. But
Yeah,
it's an emotional transition too.
it
It's a
is.
physical transition. It's
Yeah.
a different cultural transition. There's so
Mhm.
much to it. And
Yeah, the rules are different. The unfortunate thing is the divorce is chosen by the parents but the kids have
yeah,
to deal with the transitions unless you nest, which is rare and hard.
yeah.
So the kids are the ones who are packing up and having their life switch back and forth. And I think we have to recognize that that's hard and not get annoyed or frustrated with them, but have an ability to have a healthy conversation. Like my situation's unique because since my ex doesn't live in the country full time, when he does come back, they go to him for like 2 or 3 weeks, and I'll see
Mm,
them throughout those 2 or 3 weeks, but it's a pretty big gap when they go and they come home and they have to settle back in, and we run our households quite differently. And um and with one of my children in particular, I find that the level of respect of the way just he speaks to me, or uh kind of there's a slight condescending
mm,
judgment of the way this household's run. And I
right.
I know my household isn't perfect, but I think it's a very warm, loving household that they're thriving overall, so it's not
Yeah.
terrible. And I will, after 2 days, if I'm still finding that there's this disrespect that I'm feeling, I will just have a very simple conversation where I say, like, I am feeling a little bit uncomfortable with the dynamic between the two of us. And I know it's a big transition for you going
Mm,
from one household to the other. But I'm not comfortable with this. It does hurt my feelings, and I need you to just take a step back and look at yourself and your behavior and decide if you think that there's anything that you can change to adjust back to this house and appreciate it for what it is. And generally, I won't get a response, but within a few hours, the attitude has changed. And
mm,
so I don't yell and I don't try and make him feel shame or guilt. I just remind him to do a little bit of self reflection and a little bit of awareness. And it works for the most part, and I've just kind of come to accept that that conversation kind of has to take place, and it's brief and it creates the change that's needed.
yeah, and I think that this is what you're explaining about the way that you do the co-parenting and the transition is perfect. It's calmly being careful with the words you use, not causing any shame to arise, not being critical of the other parent, even though you probably want to be, or you even want to know what happened with my child in your house. And it's
Right.
okay to have that conversation if you're able to with the co-parent. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. But I do think that a lot of what our children bring back, it's not conscious. It's just their way they adapted. And imagine if you were doing this every other week. Um, it's back and forth, and it can take you have them for 4 days, and it takes them 2 days to become the child that you had before. It can be really hard. So that love, lots of nurturing, lots of regulating and being calm. Um, I would say good therapy. really helps with that. Um, I'm a great believer, being my wife's a therapist, obviously. I'm a great believer in therapy, but I also think that it's so important to be that, like we talked about, the child-focused element to this.
Mhm.
You made a commitment when you had a child, whether you
Yeah,
like it or not, to give them as much love and caring and to parent them the best that you can. No one's perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect parent. But if you can
mhm.
focus on that and not on yourself, on the relationship that didn't exist, doesn't exist anymore, or has changed to be a co-parent one, where you have a lot of resentment still, all of that has to come secondary to focusing on the child. Um,
For
and
sure.
that sounds like what you're doing. And I, I have the voice of kids in my head because I've heard a lot of things said. A lot of
Mhm.
kids talking about bringing their bags from, I forgot to bring this. I'll ask the question as a teacher, as an educator. Well, where's your book? Well, I left it at my mother's house and I'm at my dad's house now. And if you say, well, can you get it? Can someone bring it to you? Or, oh, well, no, I can't do that.
Yeah.
And really, maybe they can't. And we
Mhm.
have to be understanding, not just parents, but
Yeah.
those that interact with children of divorce. How do we make them not feel ashamed or
Yeah.
not upset because of something they don't have control over? So they can have a
Mhm.
normal child life where they are not traumatized and wounded and damaged in any way.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's a challenge.
That's the goal. It is a challenge.
Yeah.
And yeah, the parents just have to be adults and step up and be as respectful as possible for the benefit of their children. And it can be hard because our feelings get hurt and our uh, egos get hurt. And, but remembering that kids pick up on the nuances. You don't have to say anything directly if about
Sure.
something you don't agree with, but over time you just have to trust that they will pick up the good from each household and hopefully not repeat the bad that occurs in each household. No household's perfect, no rules are perfect, and but creating a loving supportive environment. And many times we don't have much control over our exes. We don't have almost any control over our exes. We hardly had control over them when we were married. That was part of the problem, that so accepting that lack of control and just embracing that you can only do what you can do when they're in your house, and creating that support and respect uh, about the fact that their other parent is their other parent and they're half the other parent's genetics. So you don't want to say horrible things about that other parent because they're half that parent. So,
That's so truly, it's you're so right. I mean, right, you don't have control over the co-parent. You may have a high conflict divorce where the other parent's never going to be okay in the way they parent or in the way they talk about you. Um, and that's, I think, where I found the Imago dialogue piece. You could do it with your child. Sit,
yeah,
listen, mirror, show love, show empathy. Like you said, Lee, it's your household. You only control what you can control. But if you can bring as much positivity, as much love, as much nurturing, as much safety as you can, that's the best that you can do. Understanding, unfortunately, that you don't have 100% control of your child, and just hope that the other parent, you know, comes around.
yeah, exactly. Well, this was a wonderful conversation. I think it's really helpful and just reassuring to people that there are tools like Imago and people like you who work with those uh, dialogues to help people learn and explore new ways of working with each other. And that co parenting is a lifelong growth challenge, and the the less we get in the weeds and the details and the anger and stay in the focus of how am I able to help my kid is where the win is.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me join you. It's been a real
Yeah,
pleasure.
I
And
really appreciate you taking the time and sharing. So tell us a little bit about where you're located, how if you work remotely as well, and where maybe people can find you. And I'll obviously add the links in the show notes, but yeah, just tell us a little bit more.
so we're located in Maryland, and the company that our name is Moving Forward, Psychotherapy and Coaching. And you can visit our website, Moving Forward. You can also call me. I am available on cell phone text. My number is 240-286-5487. And we are always looking for new clients, and we want to help people as much as we can with parenting, with Imago, and with divorce. And always excited to make a difference, hopefully in a positive way in somebody's life.
Wonderful. Well, it was so nice to talk to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for everyone on here, please like, comment, subscribe. That helps get these videos out there. And I will see you eventually on the next interview. Take care, Moshe.
You too.